Welcome back to part two. I don't know if I want to call it part two. We'll say project one of the bigger project. So yeah, we're in the moment where we're talking about building a trading system using Python. And in the previous video, we gave a high-level overview of the project and just thinking through the main actual trading component, right? So we're thinking about how do we think about the logic of trading and how do we break it down to its core components, break those components down a little bit further into something that we can actually code. So now that we have a high level overview of the whole trading aspect, we also have recognized that a trading system is not just trading. There's a data collection aspect, there's a data cleaning process. Depending on how you plan to trade and how you plan to generate signals, there might even be a machine learning aspect. There might be a modeling aspect where you have to constantly update your model to reflect current market changes. And then additionally, we saw that if you plan to make your trading system have a little bit of a user interface and interactive, there's also going to be a web component that we have to think about. So what we're going to first talk about is the data component, right? Because a lot of times when we're trading, we're using data, but our data can come from multiple different sources. And each source of data can come in a little bit of a different format. But naturally, we tend to have our data all synchronized. We like it to all look the same. We like it to all flow the same. So that way, when we do things like modeling, when we do things like further analysis, we can easily do that without spending a ton of time cleaning the data. So depending on how many sources of data you have, it might make sense for you to leverage something called a data factory. Now, a data factory is basically I would say like a collection in a sense of data pipelines where you can define steps in your, what we call the ETL process, which is extracting your data, transforming your data, so kind of like cleaning it up, and then loading it into some type of storage container, maybe a database. It could even be individual files. So it really kind of just depends. So what we're going to talk about specifically in this video is the Azure data factory and how we will leverage it in our particular project. So let's get started. Okay, so what is an Azure data factory? I have a little bit of an overview. I also have some links to some documentation that will give you an overview in more detail about the particular service we're going to be working with. But put simply, a Microsoft Azure data factory is a cloud-based data integration service that allows you to create data-driven workflows to orchestrate and automate the extraction, movement, and transformation of your data. The Azure Data Factory helps simplify and automate the ETL process that many companies depend on to do different types of analysis. One major benefit of the Azure Data Factory is that it has over 90 plus different data connectors. And that number is growing every day because they're constantly pushing out new connectors. Now, these connectors help you integrate data from a wide variety of sources at no additional cost to the user. So the first thing that we need to take away from this Azure Data Factory is it's actually cloud-based. So it's part of the Azure computing service and it's hosted in the cloud. That means you don't have to have any of the infrastructure on your local system or even in your warehouse or whatever you're building. You can have it all be cloud-based. So that's actually really advantageous because, again, say you were putting this on a large scale, you're not having to directly maintain that hardware. The probably biggest, I would say, benefit to the Azure Data Factory is that this idea that it can help simplify the process of grabbing, cleaning, and transforming your data. A lot of times when we're doing analysis, even in data science, like that is 90% of our job, it feels like sometimes, is literally just going out, getting the data, cleaning it up, and getting it ready for the actual analysis. So to have this particular tool at your disposal will, in some cases, dramatically improve your overall efficiency. Now, even something like a trading system where we might need to go and grab data constantly on a certain cadence, we can automate that process of getting the latest and the cleanest data possible. So that's really kind of the major benefit of this data factory is it allows us to do it in an automated fashion. Now, while you can manage your entire data factory with Python code, they actually provide a user interface as well. So that just makes it a little bit more simple in order to interact with your data factory. So what are the components of a data factory? Well, there's basically 4 different components. The first one is what we call pipelines. So a data factory can have 1 or more pipelines. A pipeline is just a container for activities. So basically inside your pipelines, you might have different types of activities that you're doing, right? So you might load your data. You might go and remove all the null values from your particular data set, right? So those are considered activities, and you have multiple activities that would fall under a pipeline. So pipelines can be very simple, or you can make them very, very complex. It really just depends what exactly you're doing with your data sets. That's really the big driver. A lot of people ask, well, how complex can it get? That really depends on you, and it really depends what you're trying to do with your data and how many data sources potentially you could be working with. So I would say, honestly, it's a good thing because it scales well in the sense of you can make it as complex as you want, but you can also keep it very simple and it will still work just as great. So now that we know a pipeline is made up of activities, what are activities? Well, activities are definitions of what actions to perform on your data. So as I mentioned, this could be something like copying your data, or maybe you're moving your data from one location to another location. You can also have activities where you can make them a little bit more dynamic. So you can have them run on certain cadences. So you can have certain triggers like, hey, run at this time every day, or run every time you load a file into this particular data storage service, right? So the idea is not only are they doing certain activities, but you can configure these activities to run on certain conditions. So that makes it even more flexible and gives you more control in the process. Now, we've seen in the past that normally when we're given more control of the process, it does mean we have to be a little bit more aware of that particular service or that particular component. So while this is great, it does mean we're going to have to be a little bit more familiar with, I would say, some certain finer details of these activities. The next component are data sets. So data sets, you can kind of imagine it's basically like files. It could be web URLs that lead to individual files and stuff like that. So activities take 0 or more data sets as inputs and 1 or more data sets as outputs. Data sets are representative structures of data within data stores, right? So for example, I can connect to a SQL database and I can pull a subset of the data that exists in that database, right? And I would consider that my data set. I could make a call to an API URL, and that data that is sent back to me is considered a data set. So simply put, a data set is basically just a collection of structured data that we want to do some type of activities on, right? It could be anything from transforming it, like maybe mashing it up with another data set, filtering it, removing unnecessary columns, lots of different things, right? But that's basically our data sets. Then we have our final component, which are called linked services. You can think of these as being like connection strings. They define the connection needed to connect to external resources outside of Azure Data Factory. Now, because Azure Data Factory allows you to connect to a lot of different data sources, you're going to be using linked services to connect to those data sources, right? And really, at the end of the day, I think this defines it perfectly. They're basically like connection strings. Now, they don't have to necessarily be actual data sets, right? So I can have like a connection string for my Azure Key Vault because I might have something in my Azure Key Vault. Like, for example, maybe I need to get a password in order to connect to my SQL database. So a linked service is not necessarily just data sets. It could actually be other services that you will then use to connect to potentially to your actual raw data. So while it can be connections to data sources, it doesn't necessarily mean it always has to be. You can actually expand it beyond that. And we'll talk about this in more detail when we get there. It's kind of one of those things you just kind of have to see it in action a little bit. You have to kind of walk through simple examples of actually connecting to a service to understand that a linked service is not just a data set. So ETL as a service. So basically this is a nice little, I guess it's kind of granular and it's really bad pixelation, but this was actually what they had on Microsoft Azure. And I thought it kind of gave like a nice, I don't know, flow or structure behind like ETL as a service. But really that's basically what a data factory is, right? It's just like a service that it's being provided to you, but it's really representing this whole service of ETL, which is extract, transform, and load. So they break it down into different components, which is ingesting your data, right? So you can ingest data from many different sources. You know, they highlight that 90 plus, but trust me, if you follow the blog, they're constantly adding more. So that number, I'm sure, will grow as time goes on. And then there's these control flows that we talked about. So these are kind of like these activities that we talked about. But the nice thing is it's code free. It's just like a user interface where you kind of drag and drop. But then at the same time, if you want to leverage code, you can actually convert those user interfaces. You can actually take the raw code that represents that activity. So it's really cool where you get the best of both worlds. You get that user interface experience where you can create the service yourself. But then at the same time, if you want more control in the process, you want to go more granular, you can also grab the code and leverage that in our SDKs. We have these data flows, right? So this again are the transformations. We'll be taking our data sets. We might be mashing it up with other ones. We might, do different things like remove certain data, all sorts of different things. Again, code free, but then at the same time, if you want to go and write the raw code yourself, it's really easy to do so. It integrates nicely into the SDK. So super nice. Probably another big benefit is scheduling. Constantly, I get people asking, hey, Alex, I want to pull these files on a certain cadence. Hey, Alex, I want to grab data from here. I'm moving on here at the end of every night after I'm done trading. You're probably thinking about a data factory in some fashion, but you're thinking about it in the perspective of writing it yourself. For most people, if you're only doing it once, data factory probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But if you're doing it across multiple data sources and you're going to have to constantly modify it and stuff like that, then guess what? Maybe a data factory does make more sense. People always ask, Alex, can't I just write this all from scratch? Of course you can. You have complete control in that process, but a lot of times that requires that you have the time to write that all from scratch. When we think about data flows and stuff like that, it takes time. It takes a lot of code, and I can guarantee you it's probably going to break at some point. So this just helps simplify that process and really gets you focused on what you're trying to do, which is taking data, cleaning it up, and putting it somewhere else. So it's pretty helpful, I think. Then there's a monitoring aspect as well. Like I said, things break. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, things break. So it's nice that there's some type of system built in place that helps you monitor your data flows so that if something does go wrong, so maybe the web page that you're pulling the data from, maybe it starts all of a sudden breaking down, you get a nice way of monitoring your data flows and identifying where the issue is. So how we use the Azure Data Factory here, in this particular situation, we're just going to be collecting data from maybe potentially the SEC. So we'll show you how to pull XBRL filings and maybe store them in a SQL database. We'll also show you how to connect to different data sources using API. So IEX, we already mentioned that in the previous video, but we'll show you how to connect to that as well. And then do things like make calls to it, take the data from those calls, clean it up a little bit, put it in your database, get it ready for some further analysis. So we'll show you how to connect to some of those different financial data sources. The great thing about the finance industry is they have tons of data sources. A lot of the challenges is just getting everything kind of, combined and mashed up and everything like that. So we'll show you how to do different examples. Obviously, there's so many different types of connectors. We can't obviously cover them all, but I do want to try to cover some of the bigger ones. And you might see me do some repetitive actions. Really, that's just for demonstration purposes. So we might connect to the same data source using a different link service. Really, at the end of the day, it's not to say that's what you would want to do. It's more of a, hey, if you had to ever connect to this link service, this is how you do it. So just some things. Okay, So the final thing that I'm going to do before I close out the video is I'm actually going to show you what the user interface looks like when you go into a data factory on Microsoft Azure. So we're not going to create it in this one. I just want to kind of give you a layout as to what it looks like and kind of just things to start thinking about as we go through this process of actually creating our first data factory. Now on my dashboard, I actually have my data factory right here. So I actually make it where I have like a little tile that makes it easy to easily access it. So if I click this one, it actually takes me to the individual service like this. And you can see certain information about it. You can see the activity runs, you can see pipeline runs, trigger runs, all sorts of different kind of stuff, right? But normally we want to modify our data factory or might want to even monitor it. Well, if you go from the main page, the overview page, you'll notice there's a little button here, a little kind of like section that's called Author and Monitor. If you click this one, it will open up a new tab and redirect you to the user interface to help manage your Azure Data Factory. So when you arrive at the page, this is the Get Started page, as we call it, right? And they provide you some videos over what the overview is. They give you some examples. So lots of great stuff. There's tons of videos here. So definitely useful if you want to just learn more about Azure Data Factory. And then they also have some get started ones. So if you want to do a data flow, a pipeline, copy data, if you want to use templates as well. So that's, again, the nice thing about it is I can create template for you guys. And then at that point, if you want to take that template and then leverage it in your own data factory, guess what? I gave you a head start. Fun. Tutorials are down below. Super helpful, again, if you need it. Resources, learn more, pricing, documentation, and then service updates. So again, they're constantly adding updates to it. So it's good to stay up to date with those updates. It's not free, unfortunately, but it's okay. Okay, and then from here, if you want, you can see this little pane over here on the left. These are, again, the different components of the data factory, or like I would say the different tasks normally you would use with your data factory. So one is authoring, which is basically actually building your data factory. Now, the nice thing about data factories is you can actually host them on GitHub. So if you, again, want to make your particular data factory available, or you just want it to be integrated into some type of source control framework, then you can connect your data factory with something like GitHub. So that's great because as you make modifications to your data factory, those will be immediately reflected inside your GitHub repository. So super nice. When you look at your factory resources, there's 4 main resources. You have your pipelines. So for example, these are my pipelines that I personally build, and they contain activities. So you can see here, I have 2 activities, a very simple one, but you'll also notice there's categories of activities. So there's machine learning, there's general activities, which has a lot. There are move and transform activities, the Azure Data Explorer activity, Azure Functions, batch service, and just a couple others. So you can have multiple pipelines, as you see right here. Each one of these can look a little bit different. Some are more complex, some are more simple, it just depends. Now, we also have dataset resources. So these are the actual data sets that you plan to work with. So these are ones that maybe you have some files that you want to load and then clean those up and store them in a database. These represent those locations of those files or those data sources. Again, depending on what type of activities you're trying to do. It could be simple, it can be complex. Some are actual files. Some are even services like databases, like this one's my Cosmos database. You have data flows. These are the actual transformations that you do to a particular data set. So you would actually grab your particular data set. You can remove items. You can change column types. You can add conditions based on whether one was a success or failure. And you can actually make these very complex, I would say, webs of operations depending on what the outcome is. So this is actually a relatively simple one. It can get much more complex depending on what you're trying to do. But your data flows basically define each of the operations you're performing on your data set. So super helpful. Templates, I don't have any templates right now, but again, if you want to have templates, you can. You have monitor. So like I said, you can actually put your pipelines on certain triggers. So you can say, hey, run at every day, 6 a.m. before the market opens or something like that. It just kind of depends, again, what you're trying to do. But you can put your, your data factories on certain triggers. So these one will show you the trigger runs. These will just show you general runs. So these will show you, hey, what happened when you ran this particular workflow? Did it succeed? Did it not succeed? How long did it take? Some operations are longer than other ones. So just, again, be aware of that. You can do things like integration runtimes. Again, for the most part, it's just the default one. Data flow debug. So if you had any issues, you could do that as well. Alerts and metrics. Again, you can define these. You also have manage. So these are the different connections that you can define. So basically your management pane is broken into connections, source control, author, and security. So connections, this is where you would define your linked services. So this would be things like Azure Key Vault, maybe your Azure Functions, Blob Storage, Cosmos Database, Azure, SQL databases. It kind of just, again, depends. If you want to create a new linked service, you can see there's tons. There's tons of connectors like we've already mentioned, and they try to give it in categories as well. So if you want just databases, if you just want files, generic protocols, SQL, just depends. You have integration runtimes. This is really just the compute infrastructure. This one, if you have the auto resolve, which I do, this would be the one you're going to be using. You also have your GitHub connection. So if you want to connect to a GitHub repository, you can also do this as well. Templates, parameterization templates. If it loads, if it doesn't load, I'll skip it. Yeah, we'll skip it. Oh, it just came up. No. Hold on. I want to see it, so we're going to wait. Perfect. So you can see it basically gives you this big old JSON blob. Not super helpful, but there it is. You have triggers. So you can put things on a certain trigger to run every so often. So I've done this before in the past with news articles. So grabbing from different news sources on an hourly cadence. Global parameters, I don't have any of those, but you can define them. And then security stuff, that's just like security keys. We'll save that for when we need it. But that's basically the user interface for your Azure Data Factory. We'll go into more detail when we actually create our Azure Data Factory. So we'll just create a simple one. We'll connect to a couple different data sources. And then from there, we'll also talk about some activities and pipelines, all that kind of fun stuff. Woo! All right, so that does it for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. We always love having members of our community. So again, if you're new, please feel free to consider subscribing. And then also make sure to follow me on GitHub, because I will be posting the code for this particular series on my GitHub page. And then if you want to stay up to date with just certain kind of notifications and stuff like that, I would also recommend you follow my Facebook page. I sometimes post code there, but that's more for VBA stuff. This is more just if you want to stay up to date with notifications, new projects, and stuff like that. But yeah, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you in the next video. See you soon.